"I'm sorry it's not been aired out, miss," Trudy said, taking out a rag from her apron and wiping down the bedposts. "I hope you don't mind." "Trudy, it's dry, it's private, and it has pillows. I'll be fine." Darrell, a lanky boy of 14, came up with a tub and then returned with more steamy buckets of water. A nephew in Jelly's care, Darrell had been working for the family more or less since he was 9. He didn't take up much room, nor did my uncle have to pay him much. He was a boy of few words, which in a house full of women was a rare commodity. He gave a shy touch of the forelock to me, and then ducked out of the room as quickly as he could. I wanted nothing more than to soak in the bathtub and go straight to bed, but there was no rest for the weary, not when the family was waiting downstairs. So, like the dutiful niece that I was, I wasted no time lounging in the steamy water, but picked up my sponge and soap and started scrubbing. By the time I got out of the tub, the water was a murky color of brown. Somewhere in the St. Weldon Mountains was a bag of very nice clothes. Some robber's wife no doubt would enjoy them very much. Luckily, I had left most of my Eastern clothes here at home, or I would be in sad shape by now. I found a dress, shook it out, and put it on. Trudy came up and offered to help me with my hair, which I allowed, but only because she was so much faster at it than I was. When she was done, I held the candle to the mirror to inspect myself. There wasn't a trace of Westy about me now. That should make Uncle William happy anyways. As I went down the hallway, I paused at my mother's door and carefully turned the handle. Peeking in, I saw that she was lying in bed, a book resting in her hand, but forgotten for now. She was gazing in the direction of the door and had seen it open. She lifted her head from the pillow and said, "Jane, is that you?" I opened the door and walked in. "Surprise," I said, keeping my voice quiet. "I'm home." She trembled in astonishment and then smiled widely. She held her arms out to me. Lisbette, you're home early. Oh, I'm so glad. I've missed you so much." I took her hands, kissed her, and sat down beside her. I was so homesick that I couldn't wait for Marissa to finish up with her exams. "I'm glad," she said again, resting her head back on her pillows. "So glad." There were no hard edges about my mother, from the soft little curls that she kept bunched on the side of each ear to her soft dark eyes that seemed to penetrate right into the inner parts of me. She lay in a pile of soft pillows under the softest blankets, dressed in a soft robe over her soft nightgown. I stroked her hand. It was soft and warm. "Did you have a good school year?" "It was all right." "And," she added with only the slightest of hesitation, "did you meet any nice young men?" Mother was darling when she tried to be subtle. "Yes," I said simply. She drew her eyebrows together. "Anyone in particular?" "No." She plucked impatiently at the bedspread. "Oh, Lisbette, stop playing with me." "There are hundreds of nice young men in Audleton, thousands. How could I avoid meeting them? Some of them," I said, looking at her sideways, "I liked very much." "And?" "Mother, a girl can't just sit around waiting for her betrothal contract to expire, so yes, I did date lots of men, but to be fair, I have it on good authority that Timothy was not standing idly by. He was doing his fair share of dating, too." "And did you see much of Timothy this year?" "Not so much. Although, I couldn't help adding, he did take me home." I didn't worry about her knowing the truth. From how she was talking, it was obvious that no one had mentioned to her about the soldiers or their questions. Her eyes sparkled in contentment. "How nice! You must have been able to spend lots of time together on the boat." I became interested in straightening my shawl. Actually, we didn't take the boat. We took the pass. Her face, already pale, went white. "Lisbette," she whispered. "Oh, but, Mother, nothing happened. Not a thing. We had a lovely ride through the mountains, and everything was turning green, and we got to cook our food over the fire, and—" I stopped to gauge her reaction. The worried look on her face wasn't disappearing. "Oh, Lisbette," was all she could say. "The mountains aren't nearly as dangerous as people make them out to be. In fact, it was even boring, honest. But do you know who I met? Ben Redcliffe. Remember Ben? He's married with the sweetest little boy you ever saw. And you know what they named him? Charles, after father. Wasn't that nice?" "Is that right?" she asked, the distress dispelling from her eyes. "And Ben and his wife were so kind to me." She relaxed. "Well, I suppose all is well that ends well. Still, I hope you won't take the pass anymore. I'm rather surprised at Timothy taking you. I'm sure William won't be happy when he finds out." "Let me take care of Uncle William, all right? Now, I better go join everyone. They're waiting for me." Yes, go on and say hello to the family." I leaned down and kissed her once more and made sure her covers were straight before leaving her room. I closed the door softly behind me and stood there for a moment, smiling to myself. Mother was so unlike Father. With Father, one wanted to jump and laugh and holler, but Mother, people seemed to tiptoe around her and keep their voices down, as if noise would somehow break her. Father had loved her completely and devoutly. Sometimes I thought it would be better for me to be more like Mother than Father. She was so good and so gentle. I pushed away from the door and decided it was time to face the inevitable, an evening with Uncle William. I took my time going to the west side of the house, taking in the old details of the place as I went. Much of the furniture was broken in some way, but Trudy was a wizard at hiding the defects. The rugs were threadbare, except in the rooms where Aunt Geraldine spent most of her time. Those were the rooms where the carpet was new and the walls had been repapered. Not that I spent much time there. Aunt Geraldine was tolerant of my mother's company, but when it came to her nieces, she thought it wise that we girls kept to our part of the house. Needless to say, we were in perfect agreement. I stopped on the landing to ponder the old pictures of Blackwoods gone by. Some of the portraits were so blackened with age that they were hardly pictures anymore, just framed canvases of ghosts. But those who still had faces watched me in turn as I slowly made my way to the drawing room. They seemed to be scolding me with their eyes for not being a good niece and hurrying to my family's side. At last I stood outside the room where my family gathered every evening. The doors were thrown open, and I had a full view of the inhabitants. The candles were lit, and Aunt Geraldine was sitting by the fire, reading a pocketbook of verses. Uncle William was at his desk, writing a letter. My sisters were seated side by side, giggling over the newspaper, and Lawrence was lounging deep inside one of the winged chairs, his feet propped up on a footstool. "Jane! Anne!" I cried. They looked up from the paper and called out, "Lisbette!" They ran to meet me, and we hugged each other tightly. I stood back from Anne, my youngest sister of 14, and exclaimed, "Why, Anne, you're as tall as I am." "Yes, and it's not fair." Jane, who was 18, pouted. "She's half an inch taller than me, and Mother thinks she'll keep on growing." "But I keep tripping over everything," Anne said, blushing. "Lisbette," came the sound of my uncle's voice, "you were neglecting your aunt." I left my sisters and crossed the room to take my Aunt Geraldine's hand, who remained in her seat. "Hello, Aunt Geraldine, how are you?" Aunt Geraldine had once been a striking woman, but what had once been attractive had turned into severity. Her chiseled cheekbones and aquiline nose had sent tremors of chills down my spine as a child. But now that I knew her better, I realized that the harsh outlines of her face were more from a general malady of discontent. She had been unhappy when we had visited them in their townhouse in Michaelton, and she had been unhappy after moving to the family seat in Easton. The only time her face softened at all was when Lawrence was in her sights. After having lost 3 children, he was the apple of her eye and the cherished vision of her future. Lawrence could do no wrong, unlike his female cousins, who could rarely do any right. She answered me with a languid, "I'm well enough, only we're all most surprised to see you tonight. You always were too impulsive, Lisbeth. Still, you're back where you belong, and none of us can complain." My last filial duty was to greet Lawrence, but when I turned to address him, I saw him smirking unpleasantly in his chair. "Funny, though," he said, "you're rushing home like this. Confess, what was your hurry?" "It's nice to see you too, Lawrence." I sat down on the couch with Anne and Jane. "It was really all the spur of the moment. I happened to run into Redcliffe, who told me that he was heading this way to visit his parents. And I thought to myself, why not? And so I hitched alongside with his family and came home." "Don't say hitched, dear girl," Aunt Geraldine said. "Besides," I said, pretending not to hear her, "school was all but over, and I was itching to see the new lambs that Anne had written to me about." "Itching to see lambs?" Aunt Geraldine asked. I nodded. Lambing always was my favorite time of year. "Lambs," Lawrence said with a note of skepticism. "You came home to see lambs?" I frowned at him. Do I need to repeat myself? He held up his hands. "I'm sorry. I just have a hard time believing that you galloped home early to see a bunch of dirty sheep. By the way, did you see Clay's before you left?" I leaned over to look at the newspaper on Jane's lap. There was an advertisement for hats that caught my attention. "Yes," I said absently. "I saw him. Gerard, too." Then I addressed my uncle. "You know, Gerard was quite ill in Ottleton. I couldn't imagine why you sent him. Besides, you know how he hates the West." "Gerard is a servant and must therefore earn his keep," Uncle William said. "They've the quaintest little notion about retirement in the West," I said, looking back down at the paper. "Apparently, once a person has lived long enough, he or she is allowed to stop working and actually enjoy the rest of their lives.